and by extension, other parts of the world. That is to say that this is not a region that is isolated, but it's becoming ever more deeply involved and will influence and impact developments elsewhere outside of West Africa. So altogether, this belies this general impression that the African continent is one in which there's just nothing happening. It's uninterrupted stasis for millennia. Now, of course, the larger society remains ignorant of the African past, or indeed it denies that there is such a thing as the African past. Whereas what we're going to talk about here exemplifies West African cultural creativity, in that what we see is a region that is filtering ideas coming in from North Africa, Egypt, and elsewhere, and reconfiguring those ideas and influences, right, in order to uh, reach an accommodation with what is orthogonous to the region. And so we see this with respect to agricultural expression, agricultural developments, religious expression, and even systems of governance. That is to say that what develops in West Africa may borrow from here and there, but it becomes uniquely West African in many, many ways. It also is a period that demonstrates the ways in which indigenous knowledge will be paired with the approach to knowledge from outside. Yeah, and we'll have an opportunity to talk about that. But in particular, the knowledge is approached by way of orality as well as as writing, and these things come together in a very interesting and productive way. As I've said, the region is in substantial commercial and cultural contact with global currents. And so it deserves and merits a prominent place in the discussion of world history. And I want to emphasize that because all too often, Africa does not enter the pages of world history until we get to the colonial era. And this is very misleading and something that we need to push back against. So finally, with respect to why is all of this important, in my view, what's happening in West Africa during the medieval period offers a paradigm, a way forward as to how um, political and economic circumstances in the continent and in the region as they exist today might be addressed in a way that allows for the region and the continent to flourish and to protect its interests. And so hopefully in the Q&A with Professor Chum, we'll have opportunity to discuss that. So I'm going to march through over 1,000 years of history within the next few minutes. So bear with me. Here's a map that basically more or less represents the spatial dimensions of these three entities, Ghana, the spherical polity in the middle. It is surrounded by this bluish greenish configuration, which represents the Mali Empire, and then Songhai, this golden representation. I want you to note that Songhai reaches well into the Sahara Desert at its apex, and we'll touch on that as we move forward. With respect to sources, as I've alluded to, for this very long period, we have oral and written sources, and these sources are different. They center different principal figures for different audiences. Their purposes are radically different. And so we have to try to take all of this into account as we attempt to understand what is the relationship between these sources. As such, there are early metaphorical accounts. These early metaphorical accounts will give way to externally written accounts as well as traditions that are internal that will describe events in much more specific and concrete detail. And then what we see is the rise of domestically written chronicles in the 15th century, completed by the 17th century. There is some controversy about this, about which we might have a conversation subsequently. But what I want to say as well is that, at least in my analysis, the emergence of orality in which history chronicles are entrusted to professional cast groups or griots, um, is not necessarily something that develops prior to these domestically written chronicles. So we can have a conversation about that. By way of overview of all three entities, Sunjata will found the Malian Empire in the 13th century. And we see under the legendary Mansa Musa, who's in power from 1312 to 37, West Africa, in my view, is at its pinnacle. With Mansa Musa, Islam will be embraced emphatically. Musa will break with his predecessors in building mosques in key cities, and he lays the foundation for Mali's reputation as a Muslim land. Now, I know that there is fatigue with respect to Musa's Hajj or pilgrimage and so forth, and all of this gold transfer. I will not emphasize that. But Musa is much more, there's a lot more going on with Mansa Musa with respect to how the history of the region unfolds. And so his contribution uh, is considerable. And so I will talk about that. Under Mansa Musa, we see that Mali will unify the region's three major river systems, the Niger, the Senegal, and the Gambia rivers. And so uh, West Africa becomes deeply integrated into a trans-Saharan trading network of untold value. Continuing by way of overview, the 15th century will see a dramatic shift in the political center of gravity from from Imperial Mali to Imperial Songhai. And so actually back to Gao Kikiyu, that is Kukiya, that's misspelled. My apologies. That should be Kukiya. And we see the rise of the controversial leader Sunni Ali, who's in power at the end of the 15th century. He will be overthrown by a trusted lieutenant, Muhammad Touré, who will become known subsequently as the Skilaj Muhammad. We'll talk about him. And so that's all that's all history that we know about by way of the oral and written traditions and chronicles. But I want to underscore here briefly that prior to all of this, we have significant urban development. Before Gao and Ghana in the 14th century of the Common Era, the first cities are, uh, are in evidence as early as 500 before the Common Era. By 800 CE, Gini is a cosmopolitan site with a population that, together with its satellite sites, form an urban cluster of nearly 50,000 people, which is highly significant for this period of time. The eastern Niger buccal town of Gao is the site of secondary copper processing, and it is occupied some 1,500 years before Gini. By 800 of the Common Era, we see a number of urban centers dotting the Middle Niger. So, what we know about with respect to so-called civilizational discourse, these discourses tend to diminish Africa, but it's largely through the archaeological and linguistic record that the early history of West Africa is unfolding. And so I want to note that. Mm. So, as far as I'm concerned, we really need to begin this conversation with Gao on the Eastern Buckle, El-Yaqubi, who writes in 872-73 that the kingdom of the Cauca, which is a Tuareg term for Gao, is the greatest of the realms of the Sudan, the most important and powerful. All the kingdoms obey its king. El-Yaqubi will be followed by sources such as El-Masudi, El-Mekri, and so forth in the following 2 centuries. And El-Idrisi in 1154 will write that Gao is large and widely famed. So Gao emerges as a city-state uh, projecting power and influence. And here you see Gao is on the eastern buckle, and here Kukia is properly spelled. This is the eastern buckle, and we need to understand Gao Kukia as a continuum, as they will function in tandem. Here is a representation of Gao on the Niger, a picture of it. And so here we move into what I contend should be references to the kingdoms of Ghana as opposed to a single one. We see here, this is the result of substantial migrations and interactions between Sahelian and Saharan communities. In contrast to early Gao, the early kingdom of Ghana is connected to the growing importance of Islam, but it is not initially Muslim-led. But Reform Islam's steady growth will significantly alter the region. And from the outset of the written accounts, Ghana is identified with gold. Here is a representation of that. And um, uh, this is a discussion here. What I want to simply point out here is this talks about the early development of what becomes Ghana, focusing on the town of Kumbi And Nehemiah Levzion argued long ago that the term Ouagadougou, which emerges from the oral traditions, and Ghana, which is used in the Arabic sources, and Kayamaga, which we find in the domestic chronicles, are all referring to the same political entity. And so I think that's right. And so we understand Ghana as the land of the Soninke, the southernmost Mande-speaking population. They are under the Cissé, the royal family. The the Tuaregs will refer to them as the Wangara. That's the term that you will see in the chronicles. Once they disperse, they will be referred to as the Jula, which is a term which simply means merchant, or the Maraka in some places. Hmm. And so here is another representation of Ghana. This is Kumbi Saleh, ruins from Kumbi Saleh. And this is a discussion of this PowerPoint. Here's a discussion of the ways in which Ghana is situated relative to trade coming from North Africa and from the Atlantic coast. And so you have salt coming in exchange for gold. And what I find interesting here is that El Bekri talks about Tunka Basi. It says that he led a praiseworthy life on account of his love of justice and the friendship for the Muslims. So this is a non-Muslim ruler, but what it evidences is a kind of accommodation between non-Muslims and non-Muslims with respect to for the purpose of promoting commerce and so forth. And clearly, this was a moment in which Ghana had considerable power, could field all of these people. And here, so Ghana will it will go into decline. There is an argument that, in fact, in the 11th century, it is defeated by the Almoravids. I'm not so sure about that, but perhaps that's true. There is an oral tradition which maintains that a young suitor of a maiden will kill a royal snake, bidda, a very interesting term, and that by killing it, as it dies, it curses Ouagadougou. Its severed head rolls and lands in Bure, which becomes a new source of gold. So this is representative of how the early state of Ghana goes into decline. but it rises again because uh, by the 14th century, it features as a tributary state to the Empire of Mali. So Ghana will experience a very long existence as multiple sequential kingdoms from 300 of the current era to the end of the 11th century as a non-Muslim state, then as a reform Muslim state until the first third of the 13th century, and then as tributary to Mali for another 200 years. No single regime. And so this is an area that continues on for over 1,000 years. Here are Almoravid coins, which were made out of Ghanaian gold. And so now I move to Imperial Mali, and uh, the principals here are Sunjata and Mansa Musa, 13th century figure with Sunjata, Mansa Musa in the 14th century. We are all aware of, or you should be aware of, what's referred to as the Epic of Sunjata. There are a number of oral traditions with which concern Sunjata. I read these traditions as constituting a political charter in which the various royal clans, their relative positions within this empire, all worked out by way of this charter, which ones rise, which ones fall. And so you can see here that Mali is this extensive empire stretching from the from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the eastern Niger Buckle in the east, and from the forest in the south to the desert in the north. So this is um, an enormous stretch of territory. Another map here, and uh, what shall I say here? What we have in the various stories about Sunjata is that he is in this struggle with Sumanguru or Sumaru, who's the leader of the Susu. He will emerge victorious, in particular at the Battle of Krinda around 1233, and then we begin to see the uh, the 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 rise of Mali as an empire under the Keita clan. What's interesting about the Keitas is that they claim to be descendants of Bilal ibn Rabah, the first Muadhin, a companion of the Prophet. And as opposed to others, in particular the Cisse of earlier Ghana, who do not claim to be who claim a different descent, put it that way. And so here are the our griots with the Balafon. We don't have time to discuss that too much. What can I say about Musa? Mm, that you don't know about. Um, this Hajj was critical. It was critical to Musa uh, maintaining power. It appears to, he will then become the favorite. What's interesting about this, very quickly, is that the oral traditions, for the most part, focus on Sunjata. It is the external Arabic sources that focus on Mansa Musa. And as a consequence of the Hajj, he will acquire iconic status all over the world over. He is probably represented in this 1375 Catalan Atlas created in Mallorca. And but the point I want to make is that this Hajj, it required a lot of planning, a lot of effort, a lot of resources. Here is just one section of the Catalan Atlas, which seems to represent Mansa Musa. He travels with thousands of people, all, from West Africa into Cairo. Um, and the chronicles maintain that before he enters into Cairo, he spent some nights under the pyramids. Just bringing together these two iconic representations of Africa. He will return from Hajj with the barakah or blessings of the Hajj, and uh, and so he really elevates West Africa, and he will enact a number of reforms once he comes to West Africa. Uh, I note here, however, and we can talk about this, that this is a splendid, sizzling pilgrimage and so forth. But the problem here is one that as far as I'm concerned, Africa continues to wrestle with, and that is to say that uh, the fundamentals of transregional exchange did not change. Financing and routes outside of West Africa remained under the control of trading partners. And of course, this will only intensify once the region engages with Europeans who are moving in with the knowledge of seafaring. But we can talk about that. The other point I would like to make is that Mansa Musa's pilgrimage takes place about 25 to 125 years too soon because it's prior to the development of gunpowder weapons, and had West Africa uh, been made of had West Africa had access to these weapons, our history may have unfolded very, very differently. By the time Songhai reaches its height 200 years later, it would appear that Songhai was unaware of gunpowder weapons, and which will lead to its defeat by Morocco in 1591. This is very curious because if we just move a bit to the east into the Lake Chad region, Kanem Bornu, they did have gunpowder weapons at this time, so it's a bit puzzling. But I want to once again reiterate that Musa is largely responsible for Mali emerging as a transregional cosmopolitan state. It's under Mansa Musa that Timbuktu and Guinea rise as centers of learning. It's under Mansa Musa that students are sent north to North Africa to study, and then they return and will lay the basis for uh, uh, places like Timbuktu, Jinni, Ja, and so forth, emerging as very important centers of learning. Here is the famous Jinni Mosque. And so we get to Songhai, also spelled differently with an AI as opposed to an AY, also pronounced Songhai, depending upon where you are. Mali will continue well into the 17th century, but in diminished form. But the 15th century will see the shift of power of the political center of gravity east to Songhai and back to Kukia as the capital under the controversial leader Sunni Ali. Controversial for many, many reasons. He will be overthrown by Muhammad Touré, who enters into a conspiracy with Timbuktu elites. They overthrow the Sunni dynasty. And so, like Imperial Mali, the history of Imperial Songhai also hinges on these outside personalities, Sunni Ali, Eskil Muhammad, Eskil Dawood. And under Eskil Muhammad, West Africa reaches its height of cultural efflorescence, political imagination. It's a very interesting person, Elhaj Muhammad, because what he seeks to do is to create a heterogeneous society in which allegiance to the state supersedes and transcends loyalties to clan and culture. And it's during this period that West Africa achieves its distinction, its intellectual, academic distinction with Timbuktu and Guinea. And here you see that Songhai reaches well into the desert, and for a period of time will control the salt, the salt Tagaza, which is centered in the salt region, and will stretch as far east as Agadez. So it's a different formation. And what can we say here? Under Eskilaj Muhammad, there's an emphasis on urbanity, reconnecting with states, luminaries in the central Islamic land. Some of that had been lost once Mansa Musa dies and is succeeded by Mansa Suleiman and so forth. Yeah, so a return to cosmopolitanism. And what we see here is that the various ethnic groups, such as the Songhai, the Halbular, and the Mande speakers, Keltamashek, and so forth, begin to reorient their allegiance away from their particular groups and communities to Songhai as a state. And we see that this is an extensive state. You have the figures here before you. Askia Muhammad will also have to make the Hajj in 1496 because he is not he has no right to the throne. And so he will need the barakah of the Hajj in order to reign. And so here is a rendition of Timbuktu by Heinrich Barth in 1858. Very interesting. Here is the Gingerbread Mosque in Timbuktu. Another photo of that mosque. Here is a page from a Quran that was bought in Fez in 1223. It was removed from the Ahmed Baba Center or Institute in Timbuktu for safety in 2012. And here is just a representation of just an enormous cache of manuscripts that can be found throughout West Africa. With respect to Songhai's end, you have this so-called Moroccan invasion of 1591. It comes at a time when Songhai is enfeebled. There's a lot of infighting among the royals. They're killing one another, running each other into exile, and so forth. And the Moroccans who are interested in directly accessing West African gold in their fight with the emerging Portuguese and Spanish states, they will decide that they want to directly control the source of gold. They send an invasion. 1591 is the second invasion, actually, invasionary force they send. And actually, we refer to this as a Moroccan invasion, but when you read the sources, there are a lot of Europeans who are involved in this invasionary force. It's led by a Spaniard, Jaldar, who is described as a short, blue-eyed eunuch. The Battle of Tondibi takes place in 1591. We have descriptions of that fight. Thousands of people are involved. But this firepower, the superior firepower of the Moroccans carries the day. There's an eyewitness testimony of someone referred to as the anonymous Spaniard. And he describes the Songhai archers as valiantly bending the leg, and they fasten it below the knee, rendering them immobile. So they remain in place against this onslaught, but of course this musketry is just too much for them, and it overwhelms them. Songhai soldiers sat on their shields rather than retreat. They were killed in cold blood. The invasionary force will strip their wrists of their gold bracelets and so forth. So, in my estimate, I come to the end here. Songhai represented West Africa's most powerful region at the time, and the loss of Songhai in 1591 um, leaves leaves a gaping hole in West Africa in its capability. And as we know, this is precisely the time in which West Africa will begin to encounter a very different force. along its coast. So that's my presentation. My apologies for, for moving through it so quickly. I wish I had more time, but here we are. Thank you so much. I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Professor Cham.
All right, thank you very much, Mike, for running us through so much history in so little time.
Yep.
And I want to thank the organizers, of course, from the Africa America Institute, from Howard University, Boston University, all the partners, as well as the audience that has joined us today and the audience that will join us later. I want to remind everyone who's in the audience that we do have a Q&A that we will go through. So I want to encourage people who have questions about any aspect of the presentation from Professor Gomez now to just start putting your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to go through as many of those as we can. So please start right now putting some of those questions. And before we jump to these questions, I just had a few questions myself and a discussion that I would like to have with my dear colleague and mentor, Professor Michael Gomez. The first aspect that I would like us to bring the attention back to is to really make sure that people understand the depth of the history that you're talking about, because it can be very easy to flatten the past when we're looking back. And so it's important to remember that some of these first cities and settlements that we start seeing emerging in West Africa, in that region of West Africa, in the time that you discussed, that happens 1,000 years before Mansa Musa goes to Cairo and to Mecca. 500 years before his pilgrimage, you already have in Djenné, one of these cities, like a significant settlement, I think with roughly like 10,000 people at least that we know living in those cities. And that's my first question to you. Can you walk us through a little bit to zoom back in that early period and specifically explain to us the significance in that early period of that region of the Middle Niger? How come, among all those regions in world history, how come you're able to see the development of this history so early on, given the environmental factors, given the migration factors? What is going on in that region, and what is so specific about this region that helps explain the development of these settlements, of these cities, so long before the histories that we know more commonly about, such as Mansa Musa?
Professor Cham, that's an excellent question. I don't know that my answer will be satisfactory. My sense, however, is that the region represents. Okay, so this is a moment in time in which the region that is to say, the what we're now calling the Sahara or the Sahara, which means desert, is expanding, contracting, expanding, contracting. And so consequently, you have populations moving through this area, and they're moving in response to these expansions and contractions, and they are engaging one another, interacting with one another, intermingling with one another. And so as a consequence of this movement, um, I think in the interactions of these multiple populations, I think it provides a kind of dynamic, right, for the region, and consequently, there's a lot of innovation, and there are opportunities for trade networks, right, to develop, and so. Um, I think that this explains it. I think that this has a lot to do with just the energy and the vitality of the region. Now we look at the region and there's a lot of desiccation and so forth, but that wasn't always the way it was. And so um I think that the interaction, the sharing on the part of these multiple communities um, explains the dynamism that went into the founding of these polities, sorry, not these polities, but these towns, and the emergence of urbanization. Now, so my apologies to you, Professor Cham, is that if that's not, adequate, but that's what comes to mind initially. What really strikes me is that we knew nothing about this until the archaeologists began to dig and dig and dig, and we begin to see, oh, this region is just filled with all of these towns and cities long before there's any discussion of it. And this is something that, as historians, I'm still, as an historian, and something that I'm sure you appreciate as an historian, as a rising historian, a brilliant historian. Um, it's frustrating because as historians, we work with documents, we work with materials, and those documents and materials represent um, represent um, represent not necessarily walls, but they represent, what is the word I'm looking for? Um, Points beyond which we cannot venture because we don't have the evidence to venture. We can't venture, we can't speculate. And it's very frustrating to me because, for example, with respect to Sunjata, the written record says very little about Sunjata. Very, very little. In contrast, with respect to Mansa Musa, the internal chronicles say very little about Mansa Musa relative to what the external chronicles have to say. And so this has led me to, I mean, I've been given a lot of thought into why West Africa has chosen to represent or not represent its past in these ways. I don't know that I have the answer, or the answers, but I'm thinking about it.
And it's a great thing to highlight because so several things with what you just said, right? The first one having to do with the role of archaeology, the huge role that archaeology can play. Something that makes me think about is even before archaeologists start digging and uncovering this vast archive of a past urban life in West Africa that we did not know much about. People in the region know about this. Like I'm thinking that at the time of Mansa Musa and later as the centuries go on, at the time of Soni Ali, people just walking that landscape of the Middle Niger, of the inland delta of the Niger, this vast floodplain area that creates so much life. People see, like in the Fulani language, there are references to the Toge, like these ruins that people know about, ruins of villages that are in the region where you can very easily run into terracotta figures, you can very easily run into ruins, all these signs of a past life. And that's yet another representation, I think, going back to what you were just saying, if we try to think with how people from the region saw the past and conceptualize it and experienced it also, literally just being in their environment versus how external actors see the West African past and choose to represent it, we see some discrepancies emerging. And I want to go back briefly before we turn to the Q&A because we have very little time, but I really do find this to be one of the most fascinating aspects of this history indeed, is that what the local archive, and in particular one subsegment of that archive in West Africa, is what the griots, who are custodians of the history, and I don't mean that to say in a totalizing manner, a custodian can choose what they highlight or what they cannot. They can choose what to, put a veil on, what to hide, and what to promote. And it is indeed true that in Mali, arguably our best historical export today, Mansa Musa, the best known figure from the region outside of Mali, is one that has been completely shut down by the local the griots and the oral record. And this is something to think about. that a figure that in today's setting and in in the diaspora and at a global level can trigger so many discussions, um, a lot of admiration in many cases, and there's a critical way to look at this. It's very, very important for people to know that as far as the historians of the region in his era who were from his region were concerned, they try to put a big veil on that history is simply not something they talk about. What does that mean? Did he do something so horrifying that he needed to be taken away from the historical archive? Did he betray what they thought the mission of what his mission should have been? There's many questions that this leaves open, but it's again something very important to keep in mind when we look at the sources. The external archive, the record, and the internal record differ in very, very dramatic ways. And so I'm very glad that you highlighted it in your discussion as well.
So it's a fascinating facet, when you look at these records, and then you begin to put them into conversation with one another, it becomes really evident, yeah, that the Malians are talking about one thing and the Egyptians are talking about something very, very different. And so it raises all kinds of questions as to, okay, what's really going on here? Yeah.
I see a lot of questions in the Q&A already, and so I think we should start getting through some of them, keeping in mind that we have limited time. So one of them that I see from an anonymous attendee is to ask, can you recommend good sources to know more about any of these three societies underneath the ruling class, such as diplomats, academics, influential families, so on and so forth?
Hmm.
So not so much a focus on the ruling classes, but are there sources that allow us to know more about what we might say ordinary people?
You might want to try. Well, that's hmm. Well, yeah, because all of the sources, whether they're written or oral, tend to focus on principles. Um, Oral traditions beyond Sunjata, which is really the traditions that concern Sunjata, are really, really refined. And you just don't see that type of refinement elsewhere in the continent. I think I can make that claim. A lot of the oral traditions of which I am aware are concerned with movements of groups of people and so forth, and who got to a place first and so forth and so on. But the level of detail with respect to Sunjata is really amazing. I would maybe start. So if so, there's some, the anthropological literature in French is very interesting in terms of, engaging with cosmologies and so forth, if people are interested in that. But perhaps in English, one could start with Eliasad's work. Now, this is a work on scholars. He focuses on scholars. What's the name of that book? Well, Eliasad.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but he looks at the various he looks at the academic community and the religious community in association with the academic community in Timbuktu. And there we get more of a discussion. It gives us more insight into what was going on behind the scenes, behind the political scenes, if you will. That may be a good place to start.
Okay. And we'll make sure to add a number of references. I think it should be possible, from what I understand, on the website later on, specific references to resources, text, and whatnot.
I think Eliasad's book, I think the name of it is The Social History of Timbuktu. I think that's the name. Yeah, Eliasad.
Um, all right, the next question I see from Alistair Scott says, how would French and others make reference to Mansa Musa's uncle, I believe, who is said to have embarked on a sea voyage he didn't return from? Has there been much recent research on this person?
So I did anticipate this question was probably going to come up. And my response to this has gotten me in trouble in some circles. What I will say is that there's not a lot of information about these voyages, two separate voyages. that are discussed by Mansa Musa, and he raises this when he's in Cairo. The question is put to him, how did you come to power? And so his response is that, well, there was a prior ruler who decided that he would put together this, not an armada, but this fleet of vessels, and they would sail west to see what was out there. They never returned. And then, his successor tried it, and only one person came back from that voyage and talked about this river in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that cut them off and so forth. And um so that's what we know. There's no there's no other discussion about this as far as I'm aware. And if there is more discussion about it, I'd really like information about that. My assessment is that the voyages probably were attempted. And because of primarily because of this account of this person who comes back and talks about encountering this current, the Canary Current, which is far out in the Atlantic Ocean. So it suggests to me that in fact they did meet that current. What happens to these vessels? It's unclear. A lot of speculation as to, whether, well, these West Africans reached the New World it's speculation. I think that as far as I'm concerned, so it's this unsatisfactory response for some. But I work with evidence. I work with evidence. But what I would say as well is that the technology that West Africans, the naval technology with which West Africans worked at this time, was not unlike the naval technology that the Polynesians employed in navigating the Pacific. And they were very, very successful, yeah, in going from island to island to island to island. The naval craft that they used was very similar to the naval craft that West Africans used at the time. The challenge that West Africans had was that they were trying to cross this huge ocean. Whereas, in the Pacific case, people could move from island to island to island. They did not have these vast, vast distances to cover.
All right, the next question, and if that's okay for everyone, because there are a lot of questions, I don't think we'll get through everything, but we might add 10 minutes because otherwise we're at time currently to go through some of them. And there is one from our colleague Chambi Chachaide over at Howard University who is asking a question. It's an important question. Is this golden era that we're speaking of in West Africa primarily attributed, or can it be primarily attributed to Islam and the spread of Islam? If that's the case, doesn't that confer to an extent that this golden rise is not as much about indigeneity as it is about Islam? Or would you not frame it in that way? And I think it's an important question in terms of how we think about that era of West African history and the factors that contributed to it. That probably a lot of questions have. So yes, the role of Islam, and does that or does it not, should that or should it not lead us to nuance the attributing this to the indigenous capabilities of West Africa at the time?
It's an excellent question. My response would be that so Islam is definitely the context we can't escape that. But the initiatives to 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 uh, to promote erudition is taken by the West Africans. You don't have a situation for the most, so you do have a few scholars who come to West Africa. Obviously, you have merchants and so forth and so on. But the tradition of erudition begins in West Africa, and in particular, so Mansa Musa has we have to credit him with being the person who begins to initiate this tradition whereby he's sending young Malians to Fez, et cetera, Wakala, in order to study. They come back and they establish these centers okay, of scholarship and erudition. It's very clear when you read the chronicles. It's very clear. You can see the isnads. You can follow the chains of where the traditions begin and how they spread. These are West Africans who embrace this type of knowledge, right? They bring it back, they enhance it, they put it into conversation with their own systems of knowledge, which is a very fascinating aspect of all of this. Now, now, let's talk about this with respect to, let's compare it with respect to what happens in El Andalus, or what, and then becomes, which issues into Spain and Portugal. So you have a Muslim presence, which includes West Africans, from 711 to 1492, almost 800 years, which is the basis of an incredible cultural production. Incredible. Okay. These, so the context is Islam, but the pursuit of science, the pursuit of law, the pursuit of history, the pursuit of all of these different, as well as the Islamic sciences, reach a level of refinement, okay, in the Iberian Peninsula. The context is this. The context is Islam. You can't. That's the context, you know. Um, so this represents, you know, a kind of interaction, between West Africa and the larger Dar al-Islam, the larger Muslim world. But what we see is that the West Africans, now this is like, let me be careful about this. There's a West African take on Islam. And you can see in the architecture, you see the examples of the Jinni Mosque and so forth and so on. That's an artistic expression. That's an expression that you don't see anyplace else. It represents uh, West African values with respect to what is beauty, what is architecture, and so forth. And one could say that the same thing is happening with respect to knowledge and the creation of knowledge. Yeah.
Um, all right, I will take so the next question from Yurka Huggins. How are you working with African educators, universities, and ministries of education to disseminate this important history to empower the African youth as well as those in the diaspora? Um, and I'm gonna
This is a good question, and my response would be that we publish our work. It goes where it goes. Colleagues elsewhere read this material, and it spreads in that way. Um, Both Professor Cham and I have colleagues at these other universities and so forth, and um, I don't know. I think that more could be done with respect to sharing this knowledge. Yeah. But there's so much to learn on this side of the Atlantic from our colleagues working in West Africa. So uh, pursue, uh, we do need to pursue better partnerships, better interactions. It's an important question, and I'm certainly open to pursuing these avenues because we need to have these conversations. These are global conversations that we need to have. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I can jump in briefly, because I think it's indeed an important question, and the sharing goes both ways. So there's also been a lot of important scholarship produced out of universities in Mali and Senegal and many other places by specialists there that does not necessarily due to questions of translations, due to material questions. And I think that's our responsibility here because we do have access to more of these resources to make sure that this work goes around. I'm thinking about, recent publications, even just in Mali by the late Professor Moussasso, who just passed away, but right before he did, produced a brilliant, beautiful work on Ségou and its periphery. Professor Drissa Diakité also just recently passed away, but had written and published two books right before he passed, about Sundiata and about that whole era of Mali. And so I'm sharing these examples just to underscore also that there's a lot of work that is being done by West African scholars in West African universities, and that it is, I think something that's important is that it's incumbent upon us, rather, to make sure that this work is spread, is read, is translated. That's like a very important question that very often limits the circulation of the work. And that's something that we should do as well. And also briefly plug something, if other people have not seen, but that's a free resource that everybody can access. So UNESCO, for several decades, published a General History of Africa series that covered many, many parts of the continent's history. The last three volumes have just been published now, and the one that I showed just now is the one edited by Professor Augustin Hall, where you have several contributions. Again, most of them were coordinated and produced by African scholars based on the continents about all aspects, several aspects of this history that we talked about today, as well as all other regions of the continent. And it's available for free. It's a massive online file, but you can download it. And so I really, really encourage people to have a look at this resource as well, this general history with many contributions on different aspects. And it's free and it's available to anyone. And I think that answers one of the other questions as well about next questions I see about looking beyond the West African empires, resources about ancient Africa beyond Egypt and Nubia. Again, I think there's a lot in that UNESCO volume that people can go towards. Now, the next question that I see, probably one of the final two questions that we'll be able to take from Tamas Jerox about the domestic economic systems, considering farming and pastoralist communities. Other than the external trade, what was the sort of material basis of the socioeconomic development, the mode of production in the region at the time? And also in terms of this connection between external trade and domestic economy, where to locate the institution of slavery? This is a big question. And other forms of domestic labors in that period in the Sahel.
Well, these communities were they were in concert with one another. You had pastoral communities, the Fulani. You had farming communities. They tended to work in tandem, and uh, I mean that was the material basis for these economies. And there's a lot of work on the integration of pastoralism and farming in West Africa that you can examine. Um, so that was and then mm, we have glimpses of this, for example, in the Chronicles that tangentially talk about the material basis of life in these areas, may make passing references to farming and so forth. Um, with respect to slavery, because we're moving quickly, uh, well, this is a so we've got to so I think that we have to understand the institution of slavery as something that's evolving and in connection with trans-Saharan and transoceanic systems. Uh, Stated differently, the 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 expansion, the infiltration of trans-Saharan demand and transatlantic demand will begin to impact and affect uh, internal systems of servile labor or other forms of labor. Now, this is an interesting this is an interesting question because, as we know, you had you had a free population, peasants who were pastoralists or farmers. You you had caste groups, that were involved with like the griots or the iron workers and so forth. It was just a very different. The society was very, very complex. Slavery existed, but I'm not sure that slavery existed in the form that existed in the West. There are a number of very important permutations. We come across very interesting references to people who were ostensibly enslaved, who had authority over free people. We run into instances of people who were purportedly enslaved who owned other slaves. We run into examples of people who were, in control of latifundia, large areas of farming, you know who were technically the slave of this person or that person. So I try to you know, I try to engage with this and come up with a very different definition of slavery as it pertains to the region. But without question, so you had different forms of non-freedom, if you will. I'm not so sure that the servile rank, that the numbers of the servile was very large prior to, because the trans-Saharan trade in particular initially will create a demand for captives. And by and by, that demand will begin to be met. And that will set into motion all kinds of questions, in particular, the question of who is liable, who is susceptible to being captured. And so uh, uh, it unleashes very destructive forces within the region.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Gomez. I see many questions, but I also see that we've run 15 minutes over time. And so we should probably round up. We'll make sure, I'm gonna keep tab of many of these questions and we'll make sure to try to share resources as we can. I think it should be possible on the website later to address a number of these. But very interesting questions and discussion in the Q&A as well. There was a lot that could be touched on. From everything that we discussed today, it was a long stretch of history. So again, I want to thank everyone for bearing with us and being patient. And I'm sure some more will be addressed in the sessions as well that are taking place tomorrow and the day after. I saw Professor Falungom here in the audience, and he will illuminate us as well about other forms of, history recording and writing in West Africa through the huge archive that he's uncovering. So the discussion will continue. But yeah, thank you very much, Mike, for this discussion. Again, it was very illuminating. And another reminder to people as well to make sure to have a look at Professor Mike Gomez's book, African Dominion, that covers as well this whole period of history, ranging from early Gao all the way to through the end of Songhai. And I think we'll leave it at that and we'll close the session. Yes, Michael Gomez, please go
Just
ahead.
very quickly, I would also thank you so much, Professor Chum. I wish we had more time. My apologies to all of those who have questions. I would encourage everyone to revisit the work of my mentor, Boubacar Bari, who really establishes the vision for all of this. He establishes the vision for all of this. And in his work on history, he's making the argument that that contemporary West Africa should go back to that moment in its history in which in which in which these communities were connected. Yeah. And the point I would make here is that that Mali and Songhai represent, I think, the future of West Africa in bringing these communities together, yeah, and dispensing with what our colonial demarcations and moving toward a better future. So that's what I would say.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you everyone again for attending. And I personally, and I'm sure many people, look forward to the rest of the conference and the other discussions that will take place tomorrow and the day after. Thank you.